Francois is a senior product security engineer for Boost Security.
When you see those kind of articles that kind of, I guess, might have a little bit of a provocative or something that title that kind of challenges, just start to tell your developers from now on, you're responsible for security after you've just read they are forced to have security by their customers, like live focused on achieving much larger goals, like maybe like SOC 2 compliance and clicking through code, the large code base, just figuring out, like chasing the well, it's a big question, and I think his answer would be with threat model. Like everything starts with the threat model. For the listeners that may not be familiar with the SLSA, to share a common language in the industry when we talk about supply chain threats. If they're not trustworthy, they're compromised, then your CI is compromised.
Hi everyone, this is Purushottam, and thanks for tuning into Scale to Zero podcast. Today we have a guest who is focused on who has spent a lot of time in like supply chain security, application security. So I'm super excited. The guest is Francois. Francois is a senior product security engineer for Boost Security, where he leads the supply chain research team. He has over 10 years of experience in building AppSec programs for large corporations such as Intel, and also has worked for smaller startups as well. He has been in the heat of the action as the DevSecOps movement took shape. And he's one of the founders of NorthSec, and he was a challenge designer for the NorthSec CTF. It's wonderful to have you in the show. Do you want to briefly share about your journey?
Yes. Hi. Thanks for having me. As you kind of mentioned in the introduction, I've been focused on application security for now over 10 years. Before I was, a software engineer, so I started my career writing code like any other engineer. But when I left college, that's kind of I didn't have a formal kind of security training in the university, just like software engineering. But it was the case that I have always been interested in security since early childhood. So whenever as soon as I started to get into programming, like computers in general, security has always been a focus of mine. Just that got into college, software engineering, and eventually went into AppSec and security in general, like full time. But it's been a nice journey, like joining a small startup about 10 years ago and being acquired by Intel, like managing application security at a large scale. It's been like, and then now back to Boost Security, which is creating a product to help security teams like manage the sheer complexity of the AppSec programs, modern DevSecOps environment. So it's been a very good journey.
Lovely, and I'm looking forward to learn some of the things that you have built or learned as part of your career. So let's start, right? But before we start, one of the things that I ask every guest is, what does a day in your life look like? Because I get different answers from everyone. I'm curious, what does a day in your life look like today?
Sure. Yeah, that's what I like about my job now at Boost, is that I get to think, I get to dream, I get to build the product that I would love to have used in the past. So that's really what convinced me to join the team here, and to actually, I'm one of the very first employee, and came in with that expertise, that know-how of managing application security in small, medium, large enterprises, knowing the challenges, the expectations of those companies at the different stages of maturity, and just keeping up with the industry. So like now at Boost, my day looks like a split between product aspects in the sense of like thinking what the product should be, like defining the features of it, talking with customers. So I have different onboarding meetings with customers to understand their needs as it evolves. The kind of industry news, kind of just keeping up with like best practice, the new things like new threats, and as well
Mm-hmm.
as doing code review, like just threat modeling, updating, so spread between kind of all the pieces, like more like business side as well as very technical, where I lead my security research team that's kind of coming up with new threats, like
Mm-hmm.
so being on the forefront of the supply chain research.
That sounds exciting because you are doing both the product side and also
Mm-hmm.
from the engineering side also, right? So that you're helping
Yes.
your organization stay secure. So yeah, that's a good way. Let's start. So today we are going to talk about few topics, right? Both supply chain and application security. Let's start with the application security.
Mm-hmm.
So a few months ago, Forbes published an article that said that application security is not a developer first problem. So we'll tag this blog when we publish the video, and it highlights two things, right? One is developers are not trained for security because and also they are not hired for security either because they are hired to solve engineering problems. So what's your take on this?
Yeah. I would say first, when you see those kind of articles that kind of, I guess, might have a bit of a provocative or something that title that kind of challenges conventional wisdom of the modern DevSecOps shift left mentality. I
Mm-hmm.
think first, often with that, like that's the case often with Forbes articles, they are a little bit of disguised promotional pieces. So this article is written by the CEO of an AppSec vendor, so just need to, whenever you read those articles, you need to understand who's writing and their
Mm-hmm.
hidden agenda. But that being said, I agree with the ultimate message of the article. It's just that the title's kind of maybe a little bit provocative, um, and just maybe at first when you see it, like it might think, oh my god, like is it like shift to right instead of shift left? No, it's not the case. Just that the article is just saying, don't expect that you will just start to tell your developers from now on you're responsible for security after you've just read like had a simple OS top 10 training. Here you go, like go ahead, like from now on write secure code. Of course, the reality depends on the size, like the scale of the corporation, like the company. If you have
Mm-hmm.
a very small team, you're just trying to do your best overall, like with the resources you may have.
Mm-hmm.
And at the larger, like on the other end of the spectrum, you need tooling, you need like to address the scaling issue. So it's really something that, in fact, like our tool, like product, we're trying to kind of address both ends of the spectrum, like small teams that are starting from 0 to 1, like they
Mm-hmm.
have no dedicated full-time security person. They just want to do something about security. And then when you get to another, like in the middle, like you might have one person, but that person is swamped with managing, triaging vulnerabilities, or even finding them by running various tools, doing code reviews, just like a matter of one or very few people with a big problem, and then on the other
Mm-hmm.
end, like a large enterprise just like dealing with sheer scale, like multiple departments and the politics of it all. So I think the article is right to say that it is not a developer first problem, in the sense that it is not the strictly the responsibility of the developers. It should be the overall company's responsibility. And yes, of course, people that write code have ultimately are ultimately potentially introducing the problems. And when
Mm-hmm.
they review code, if they don't have the right training, they should have some support either with the tool that I think that's what the article was kind of trying to address by talking about
Hmm.
automation. The tool you may use to help those developers that might have very little training
Hmm.
is critical. Like the better the tools, hopefully the better it can help to maximize or to really achieve this shift left idea. Um,
So I have a follow up question on that. You mentioned about the spectrum, right? Like, let's say a startup which has maybe either no security engineers or just one security engineer,
mhm.
versus an enterprise where they have security engineers, but they have so many departments, it gets overwhelming to manage. How will you use automation or tools in both of these ends of the spectrum? How do you look at that?
Yeah, I think on the small scale of the spectrum, like a small team that's just trying to start to do some
Hmm.
security to you know maybe we're talking I when I was doing consulting, a lot of the small startups that were reaching out to me, they were in the fintech sector, like your finance technology, like banking, disrupting kind of finance technologies, um, because they're in a regulatory context, like their customers expect a
Right.
lot from them, which is very different from other types of startups where they're just shipping as fast as possible because they don't even know if they will survive, and security is
Hmm.
not a big concern. So on that side, like they are forced to have security by their customers, like live or die situation, to have some security to even get the discussion. So for them,
Hmm.
they're just happy to have a tool which they will just click something, it will run some like scanners, get some results, but like really the low hanging fruits, the things that they can fix quickly, easily, and reliably by not introducing more problems. So kind of OS top 10 things with very high confidence, and give really good contextual information so that you're really achieving this shift left mentality by training the people as they are faced with the problem. So really kind of incremental training knowledge, uh, very contextual. Versus the other side, you might have an entire team, an entire department, security, that's focused on achieving much larger goals, like maybe like SOC 2 compliance and just collaboration between different departments, which politics of it all. So for in that on that side, the tooling is much more about the scale, as I was mentioning. So you want to facilitate to ensure that those scanners are running on as like all the source code that it should scan, which might be challenging. You might need to have the approval of different people who might have the permission to even set up the scanners, right?
Hmm.
So this is the kind of challenge we may have, and like when we design our product, we talk with the customers, we understand those issues, and we try to make sure that it's as frictionless as possible, even in those larger size enterprise. Um, but yeah,
Okay.
I think also the article is mentioning kind of automation in the context, like more modern context of AI, like LLM and Chat GPT world. I think from that perspective, we're at, in terms of hype cycle, we're still early on in the LLM hype. But I think that it's a very very promising technology. Like if even if we try to push away all the hype. Um, my concrete experience using it, I can
Hmm.
see that it will definitely change things. It will definitely improve the tooling with regards to application security. But it needs to be done smartly. Like it should not just be using LLM for the sake of using LLM because it gets you to have VCs give you money. Um, it should really try to extract like the know-how, like the all the things that a security analyst has learned over time, and bring
Mm-hmm.
it into the LLM so that it increases the velocity of a security analyst. It's not a matter of like replacing it, just a matter of helping with that scaling issue, right? Like people are
Right.
swamped with like thousands of vulnerabilities. If the
Mm-hmm.
LLM is not only triaging, prioritizing, but like when the analyst is looking at something, it's really providing this digest, this summarized view of what are you looking at. Because I remember, before those tools or even like good modern tools, I would spend most of my time just clicking through code, the large code base, just figuring out, like chasing the code base to validate if the SQL injection is really like something I should address right now, or yeah, no, it's maybe not a false positive, but there are so
Mm-hmm.
many variables in play that it's not a short term priority. So
Yeah.
I think it's
True.
very promising tech.
Absolutely, I agree with that. One of the things that I want to ask as a follow up is, like, we spoke about both the ends of the spectrum, right? With tools and all. For an organization which is just starting their security program, let's say they are a startup, in fintech or health tech,
Mm-hmm.
where security is important, right? Um, how should they think about like, are there any areas of AppSec which they should start with? Like, is it the vulnerability management, or is it like the dependencies, understanding the dependencies, or is it more on secret detection? Which area they should start with?
Well, it's a big question. Start with, I think, with like many things. I think, and you had a great guest in the past, Brooke Schoenfield, which
Schoenfield,
I
right?
worked with at Intel, and I think his
Oh,
answer
wow,
would
okay.
be with threat model. Like everything starts with the threat model, and I would agree that understanding what you're working on, like what's the context of what you're building, what are the impacts, like where is this thing gonna be deployed, and that's when we get into the supply chain, which I think we'll discuss after.
Mhm,
This is very important, and for a small organization, I think they want to start with something very lightweight, just like this, just using the diagrams they may have to design the software, and just having this attacker's mentality on it is very
mhm,
good to start. But otherwise, for a very small organization, once they just think about their code with the red team perspective, um, there are a bunch of open source scanners they can use, and they will get those low hanging fruits. I think you were mentioning secret scanning. I think, yeah, for
mhm,
sure, like it's those extremely easy to fix and extremely easy to create problems, like just copying a secret and pushing it in the source control.
mhm.
There are good tools to address that. It's just like it's a solved problem, if you will, but unfortunately it's still happening. And so I think
Right.
enabling features in GitHub, for instance, if you're using GitHub, just scan for secrets, other scanners. It's like,
Mhm.
start with that, and then use open source tools to just have a baseline. Like you've scanned it once, you've hopefully have eliminated the low hanging fruits, but then just a journey to continue and keep it current, right?
Makes sense. And I like the word that you use, right? It's a journey. It's not that you just scan it once and you're done.
Hmm.
You have to fix the ones that you have found out as part of the baseline, and then continually do the scanning and keep fixing them, rather than it's a one-time activity, rather than thinking that it's a one-time activity.
Yeah.
um, yeah, makes sense. So I want to go to supply chain security side now.
Hmm.
So nowadays every software you look at has some dependencies, right?
Yeah.
Some dependencies to open source or something like that. and that makes us vulnerable to supply chain security. So, what are some of the top security risks today around supply chain
That's,
security?
nowadays we put a word on it. We call it supply chain, but it's been, I think, for any smart security analyst, it's been something that's been keeping them at night for decades, right? It's just that now we have a simple, short way to talk about this, uh, and there's enough focus, there's enough attention to this problem, thankfully, or for the right or the good or bad reasons of, like, not to mention solar winds and all that. But
Hmm.
I think, to answer your question, the, the top supply chain problems, I think, yeah, as you mentioned, open source dependencies. I think you can hardly find anything today that's not depending on open source dependencies, like libraries from npm, pypy, or any other open source package registry. So I think it comes first, thankfully. Like, if I go back more like 10 years ago, we didn't necessarily have those, like, packaged JSON, or, well, or Maven. If I go back to Maven, like, maybe that's kind of when it started, like, this
Hmm.
type of have one manifest where you have all the dependencies, and not just copy paste like jars, and have them in your source tree, and you don't even know where you copy pasted that jar from. But
Right.
for sure, like, ban anything that just dropped in the repo. That's like the very first thing to do. You need to
Hmm.
have something clear. If we're not even
Hmm.
talking about the SBOM at this point, like, very minimal, like, have a manifest, like package JSON, or be it some other technology like requirements txt, where you know what you're depending on. Then after,
Right.
if we get into SBOM, that's more about, like, just a more official way to keep track of that, and not just, like, when you look at it from, if you have a Docker image, you want to scan the actual final artifact that's actually running in production, because it adds many more dependencies, not just what's
Right.
in your repo, but then
Hmm.
adds. And maybe at that point, in fact, there are things that are only in your CI, like dev dependencies, like development scoped dependencies, that are not in the final production artifact, but they are in your CI. So, like, there are kind of two things to tackle. But yeah, I think understanding your dependencies is key to start your journey in terms of supply chain. And then after, yeah, again, it comes back to threat modeling, like
Hmm.
understanding
Yeah, I
your
thought you will
your
go there.
yeah, like understanding your artifact, like what you're building, where it's running.
Hmm. Hmm.
um, and then, like, are you then becoming a new input into an entirely different organization, right? Like, you are a vendor, you're providing a piece of software that other companies are running,
Hmm.
either as a service or, like, on premise. Then
Hmm.
you need to really think of you as the input of someone else's supply chain. Uh, if that is the case, and you're not
Hmm.
just, like, writing a software that's for your own use, and you don't, sell a service or a software. Yeah, I think it really comes down to starting to
Okay.
understand that. And
Hmm.
yes, like, for instance, like, solar winds, again, is a very good example of that. Is like, uh, they they are still, like, a US DoD supplier, so they write a piece of software which runs in network, like, as a network monitoring tool in very
Hmm.
high risk environments. So they produce something, and if they're compromised, they then they are the responsible for a compromise of another organization. So I think
Right.
that's where you need to
So
start
there
with.
are two aspects, right? As you highlighted, one is security of your own code, and also when you're using a vendor, security of theirs as well. One of the things that you highlighted, which I really like, is the dev dependencies. Generally, we do not think about dev dependencies because we think that, yeah, it's not going to production, but it is going to the CI system, right?
Yes.
I think the threat modeling mindset helps look at this also.
Yes.
So I just want to touch on that for a little bit. Like, when I look at supply chain from a threat modeling perspective, how do I assess the security of my supply chain? Like, other
Yeah.
than, let's say, dev dependencies, what other areas should I look at?
I think for the listeners that may not be familiar with the SLSA model, it would be a great
Mm-hmm,
moment to mention that. We wrote, my team has wrote a series of articles on the topic related to supply chain with the perspective of the SLSA, which is
mm-hmm.
the supply chain. It's always those acronyms, you know. So it's supply chain levels for software artifact. The idea being
Okay.
that it's a generic threat model to share a common language in the industry when we talk about supply chain threats. So,
Mm-hmm,
and I think the promise, the goal of Salsa is to become a tool for compliance so that when you sell your product to someone else and they want to understand the level of risk they're taking into their own environment and their own threat
mm-hmm,
model, they
mm-hmm,
can hopefully trust your attestation that whatever you're giving them as a software artifact um, has had a certain level of due diligence in terms of the supply chain. So you have, you know, a piece of like a binary, let's say compiled jar or whatever.
mm-hmm,
Where was this built? Like, can you trust that the source code that went into building this jar was validated against code vulnerabilities? Is it signed? Like, you know, where was it built? Who touched it, and all that? So that's what
mm-hmm,
Salsa is trying to address. Is like provide the level of confidence, like level 1 to 4, where level 4 is everything is signed, it's hermetic build, it was run in an environment that cannot be modified during the build time. And it kind of touches what you just, your question was about the development dependencies. Yes, they're not
mm-hmm.
running in production, but they are running when you run your tests or linting or building. And if they're not trustworthy, they're compromised, then your CI is compromised, or at least potentially compromised. And then you cannot trust anything down the chain. So that's, you know, the whole supply chain. So if
Right.
the earlier in the chain you have an opportunity for compromising, then everything that follows after is not to be trusted. And how do you do that? And keeping the chain linked is hopefully
Mm-hmm.
using some signature, because if you don't have any signature, you're not sure that, you know, the previous step in the chain is really what it's claiming to
Secure
be.
enough or not? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, the follow-up question to that would be, let's say if I am thinking about, if I'm starting to build the supply chain security program in my organization, how do I go to, let's say, my upper management and convince them that it has value? Because security often is not seen as a first priority, right? So how do I go to my upper management and show them the value so that they buy into the program, they invest, they, let's say, hire engineers, or they buy tools or whatever is needed to make sure that we are secure from a supply chain perspective?
Well, more and more it's going to become mandated, like in terms of procurement. The U.S. government is making a big deal out of that because of SolarWinds was really the impetus to push the industry and the U.S. government to take that seriously. Uh,
Mm-hmm,
so it will be, if it's not already mandatory, and to come with that SBOM, to come with some degree of compliance proof that you've done the due diligence. So where do you start? I think, and where do you start, and where how do you convince management? Well, yeah, I think the management will be convinced in the near future if they're in an industry where this comes into play, and it's going to be viral. Like, once you have a downstream dependency of a big product which is used by the U.S. government, then that little open source project that another like big vendor is using, it will be either they will stop using that dependency because that dependency is not meeting the bar, or
Mm-hmm.
they will maybe like invest in improving the security posture of that dependency. And that's something that the Linux Foundation has been very good at. Like they created this open SSF Foundation security kind of aspect of Linux Foundation to look at the supply chain security of open source components. And they have a number of great initiatives, one of which called the Alpha Omega project. And they are basically keeping track of the top 1,000 most dependent on dependencies by important products, and ensuring that they're properly staffed. Like, it's not just open source maintainers that are doing that as a side project, that they are paid
Mm-hmm.
for that, like they're incentivized and they're provided the right help
Mm-hmm.
to care about it. And then the Omega project is really for the long tail of all those other projects which are too small to be directly like the direct dependency. But often when you start to look at your dependency tree, you have transitive dependencies, dependencies of dependencies. And then
Right.
when you go down that rabbit hole and you don't sleep at night, because if any one of those downstream is compromised, then
You
potentially
are
up the
compromised.
chain, yeah. So it's a very big, complex problem, which is going to take
Mm-hmm.
many, many years to address. But
Mm-hmm.
it all starts with understanding your dependencies, I think, and the salsa model is a great thing to also understand your own level of risk and which threats you need to consider.
Yeah, like speaking of transitive dependencies, I was at AWS Reinforce, and there was a vendor who was showing the graph, right? Like how what dependency you have, what dependency that dependency has, and like he was going deeper, and it was like at least 10 to 11 levels deep, and then he was like, I can't keep track of it anymore. And
Mm-hmm.
also within those there are different versions as well, right? Let's say you are using a particular package, one of the dependencies is using one version of the package, another dependency is using another version of the package, so it gets out of control
Yeah.
in a way.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely a tough problem to solve. One of the things that you highlighted early on as part of your day-to-day job is like staying up to date, right? What's going on in the industry, what are the new threats and all of that. uh, what how do you do that
I think
to
my favorite, shout out to Clint Gibler from the TLDR
security? Yeah.
newsletter. Is an
Hmm.
amazing resource. Like every week that he comes out with a newsletter, I mean, very often the things that are in there, I had not seen them. Sometimes, like, oh yeah, I
Hmm.
was I was like a few days in advance, but it's really really
Hmm.
good. Like, I think people proactively push stuff before they're published, so he has like the scoop. And in
Hmm.
fact, one of the articles that I published was pushed in the TLDR. It got very, actually the two articles, so it got very good attention. Like people contacting me, like speaking at conferences. So I think this newsletter is the gold standard for the AppSec supply chain and all that. Like, if you're not
Hmm.
already reading TLDR Sec newsletter, you're just like, you're not up to date.
True.
That's if start with that, like, and then you will already have the the gravy train of just like new good stuff every week, and then you're just
Hmm.
overwhelmed because just going back through the archive of TLDR Sec like 1 year ago, you will find gems that should be known about.
Yeah, and that's a very good one. I do receive that as well weekly. Another one is the Marco Lancini. He also writes
Hmm.
about security. He also has a weekly newsletter, right?
Yeah.
Including the security topic. So that's also in my list of like newsletters. So last question that I have on the supply chain security is, so we spoke about how to address, how to go to the upper management, the how do we train developers so that they, when they, let's say when they are evaluating an open source library, what steps should they take before they introduce into the like their own product
Hmm.
as a dependency? Is there a set of steps that you follow when you do that?
Yeah, I think if I could say something very quick, like if I tried to give a simple answer, I think deps.dev. If you're not familiar with that, it's an initiative by Google. So you go
Hmm.
like deps, deps dot dev. It's a website that is called Open Source Insights, and you basically type the dependency you're considering to add as a new library, and it will give you a bunch of statistics, and they keep track of all the versions throughout time, and they do an analysis like using this OpenSSF
Hmm.
project called Scorecard. So Scorecard is a really great tool that you may want to run against that potential new dependency you may want to add. And what it will look for is the low hanging fruits in terms of supply chain for a given dependency, so that you know that you're not about to add something really horrible. So like something where it is unmaintained, like nobody has committed anything to that code base for years. So basically, you have no hope that if there is a vulnerability, it will be patched. Like there's
Hmm.
someone to just answer some researchers finding vulnerability. So short of, we say, oh, there are CVEs and that. Well, that's because there was someone on that open source project that well, either it was just like disclosed like without the intervention of the maintainer, but hopefully there is someone to fix it, right? And
Right.
then to have a patch, not just a CVE, is like it's vulnerable, but like you have no option to just patch it, because that's pretty bad. Because if you're stuck with no patch but a public
Hmm.
CVE, you have a 0 day on your hand, and you need to quickly change to another library, rewrite your code. So you don't want that, right? So the
Right. Yeah.
maturity of the project you're about to depend on, uh, keeping up with the dependencies, like, and this tool dev is about this graph, right? Transitive graph dependency. It shows that, so you will see how much you're about to take on, like how much complexity is going to be added to your own graph, and a
Oh,
bunch of
nice.
other like key metrics, like does it have branch protection? Are people doing code review on every pull request before it gets merged, and other things? So I think that's a
Yeah,
really
those are
great
some good
resource to
metrics
start.
actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are some good metrics which can help you evaluate whether you should go ahead with a particular library versus an alternative, right?
Yeah.
To avoid, as you said, like 0 day, and you have to find an alternative, use that in your library. Uh, it will take a lot of your time, and also when you are getting attacked or you are vulnerable, it's even more tricky, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll definitely tag this when we publish the episode so that our audience can also
Hmm.
go to that and start leveraging it. Um, so yeah, that's a great way to end the security questions. Thanks, Francois, for the engaging conversation. Here are a few important points which stood out for me. The first one is, from an application security perspective, threat modeling is key in when you include the context into it. Look at your architecture diagrams and start evaluating them from an attacker's mind or attacker's perspective. When using open source dependencies, start with a baseline vulnerability scan and do a continuous process to review and evaluate each and every dependency. The third one is, understand dependencies and SPOMs to verify the validity of the dependencies. And one of the tools to do that is deps.dev, which is deps.dev, which assigns a score based on how actively it is monitored, how frequently vulnerabilities are patched, among many other parameters. Let's go to the security practice rating section. So the way it works is I'll share a security practice, and I would ask you to rate it from 1 to 5, 5 being the best,
Mhm.
and you can add some context like why you are giving a particular rating. So the first one is use strong passwords that contain a mix of uppercase, lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols, and change your passwords frequently and avoid using the same password for multiple accounts.
Just to be sure, the best being 1 or 5.
5 is the best.
Okay, so I think this whole thing about using strong passwords, I would agree, but changing frequently part of this question would make it, if we just focus on that for a moment, the worst. Like, it's the worst practice if we mandate that people update frequently, because it's really not about like updating. Because this, I mean, why does it come up? I guess this whole thing like is back from the 90s and assumes that you have such bad passwords that people will guess them and you will be compromised. Well, just start with having great password that no one can guess, and the only
Mm-hmm.
way that this thing leads to a compromise is because something else went wrong. Like, it's not the fault of the password. If you use a password manager with a great master password and you have unique very strong passwords everywhere, then like you don't need to change your password frequently. So this would be the worst if we focus on the change your password. But the other side, the one about having strong password and all that, the mix of uppercase, lowercase, number, symbol, and all that is not nearly as important as having a long password. So if you just look up the math behind it, if you have anything beyond 15 characters or something, even if it's just alphabetic, 15 characters, and it's not obvious, it's not just ABC through Z,
Mm-hmm.
then in that case, it's very strong. So adding uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and symbols, in fact, you should not care about that. It should be the job of the password manager to just like
Mm-hmm.
do it. And
Mm-hmm.
if the website is only accepting 12 characters and with like symbols and whatnot, but not certain symbols, it's already a red flag. It means that that website has some weird quirks of the software that's preventing them from accepting this character set. It's like, that's bad. But in fact, like NIST years ago removed this whole like change your password frequently thing. So yeah,
Frequently.
yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. And the more frequently you have to change, you start writing it somewhere, which
Yeah,
defeats
people
the
you
whole
have
purpose.
tricks. People like
Mm-hmm.
you have a large corporation that's still doing this kind of 1990s idea of change it every month. Like, people start to have ways to just append extra characters, and then you're just
True.
back to square
Yeah.
one. Like, no,
Pass at 1 to 3. Now I add 4 to it
yeah,
or
exactly.
5 to it or something like that. Yeah, it doesn't keep you secure anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so going to the next one. Always lock your computer when you leave your desk, even if just for a short time.
Mm-hmm. I think I mean, it's definitely not a bad thing. It is a good thing. So I think in terms of like 1 to 5, if one is the best, five is the best. I would say it's kind of not the most important thing, but it is important. So let's call it 4 or 3.5. Um,
Okay.
but I think nowadays, in the context of working from home, like remote work, it's much less relevant, much less important than in a big workplace where you have a lot of people and potentially strangers walking past your desk. In that context, of course, like locking your computer is important, but
Mm-hmm.
if you start to consider that like a stranger walking up to your desk that's unlocked or even locked, like if it's locked in a screensaver with a like password thing, it still means that most likely full disk encryption is the keys are in memory. So like
Mm-hmm.
it comes down to threat model. Like if know your adversary, if your adversary is gonna take your laptop that has like a password screen lock and start to scrape the memory, like it doesn't matter. Like you locked your screen, but the data is potentially still fully decrypted in memory.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, work
So,
from
so
home versus
any
like in a big environment, it's not as
right.
important.
Yeah, yeah. And also if you're working from, let's say, cafes or outside where there
Of
is,
course.
it's a shared space, you have to be extra careful. Makes sense.
Exactly. So like
Uh,
know the environment you're in, and of course lock your screen when you're walking. Just make it a habit. Do it, but
mhm.
don't think that you're just protecting everything like against any and every attacker, right? So
Mhm. Yeah, makes sense. The last one is conducting periodic security audits to identify vulnerabilities, threats, and weaknesses in your systems and applications.
I think this on the spectrum of you know good to bad. This would be kind of in the middle. It's not.
Okay.
It is good to conduct periodic, but it should be continuous. So that my point is that the practice of doing it only point in time periodic
Mm-hmm.
is not great. It should be kind of all the time, but all the time
Mm-hmm.
in a way that's manageable as an AppSec program, which means
Mm-hmm.
tooling and all that, of course. So I think this practice is more about like pen testing. So yes, to have like some external third party opinion on a periodic basis, yes, but it should not be the only thing. It should be one of the many things in your AppSec program. So yeah,
Okay, makes a lot of sense. And that sort of concludes the episode. Thank you so much for
thank you,
joining us and sharing your knowledge on both application security and supply chain security.
thank you,
Yeah, absolutely. And for our viewers, thank you so much for watching. Hope you have learned something new. If you have any questions around security, share those at scale20.com and we'll get those answered by an expert in the security space. See you in the next episode. Thank you.